Hello, everybody. Welcome to this last session of our course on social planning. We'll be talking today about social innovations in social planning. So I think it's a nice way of concluding our course in that we are going to try to think of this concept, to think about this concept of social innovation, what it means, and how it can maybe help us to have a critical look in the end of the day over social policy making, so over the way social policy schemes are developed and the way they work in the various policy fields that we are concerned about. Um, so I hope that you will find this issue interesting, and I hope that it will be for me as well the opportunity to kind of come back to various issues that we have handled over the time of the course, and that we can maybe sum up or refresh some of the issues that we have handled so far. I know that yesterday's course, the course about social services, was maybe a little too long, so I will try to keep this course a little shorter. Anyway, there's a little less material than maybe in other sessions, so I hope that we can keep it rather not short, but let's say in a timely manner. Okay, so maybe just a first question as an introduction. What is the context? Why is the issue of social innovation important? And historically as well, you know that I'm always interested in the way issues and concepts and norms and questions are channeled to us via historical developments, and I think that this is particularly true, specifically true for this issue of social innovation. If you look at texts, reports, critical analysis, academic writings on social innovation, you will find it's almost a ritual. Every contribution or good contributions on social innovation would begin with a very simple remark, and they would begin by saying, you know, social innovation, it's an interesting concept, but it's a very vague notion. It's something that is not very well defined. There's so many definitions, there's so much vagueness, there's so much fuzziness about this notion of social innovation that it's a kind of, at some point, disturbing notion. So I would like us to really be very aware why this is like this, and why maybe this notion of social innovation is so open, but many people say that it's a vague notion. Okay. In my view, this has there's a good reason for that, and the reason for that, the most important reason in my view, is that social innovation has been developed almost simultaneously, and so on the same time, from the late 1980s, and it has been an important debate up to now, but it has been really an important debate in the late 1990s and the 2000s. And I think that there were various milieux, various networks, various policy orientations that have reflected about this notion of innovation. First of all, about the term innovation in itself. I think innovation, so I said, that developed simultaneously in various contexts, okay, with a common basic idea. Innovation differs from invention. So an innovation, this is less than an invention. This is really the way that maybe an invention, maybe a new technique, maybe a new technology can be useful for the users. So it's really the idea of innovation is centered on specific needs, on our needs in the end of the day, on users' needs. And I think if we try to think back, well, for most of you, I'm sure at the 1980s, maybe you were not there because you were not born. But in the 1980s, um, we have had in the Western world a very strong focus on science, on new technology. It was the beginning of computers and the idea that computers and information technology is going to change everything. So there was a lot of public discussion about new techniques, new technologies, and very much centered about this idea of innovation. So it's not only new um, scientific discoveries, but it's the way these new scientific technologies are going to be useful for us as users. Okay, and so this notion of innovation was very popular from the 1980s, and it has been very popular as well in the context of social policy. And I think that there were two specific social political contexts in which it has developed a lot. First of all, we have to think specifically of the context of the United Kingdom, I think, which is the country in which the neoliberal revolution has started in Europe. And this is the country as well where new public management has been developed early, very early, because Margaret Thatcher and her very liberal government and her idea that the state should shrink and that social policy should get cut and that social expenses should get cut and that the administration should be more efficient, so should cost less and produce more. So these ideas, which seem rather common sense for us now from this perspective of today, they were quite revolutionary as they were introduced from the late 70s. She was elected in 79, but she has unfolded her program and her project from the 1980s, of course. And in the context of this liberal revolution, if you want, this idea of new public management, so the idea, maybe social innovation seems far away now, but I'm going to explain it. So in this context, new public management, so the idea that we should introduce private business management norms, procedures in public affairs and in third sector affairs as well. So that associations at some point should be managed the way private companies are managed. Maybe again, for our perspective now, it seems something rather usual and rather old news, as they say, but at that time it was completely revolutionary. So it was the introduction of performance standards, for instance, output control. So performance standard. What is the involvement of the personnel, of the staff, for instance? How do the staff members perform? So this performance standard that people should report on their activity. What do I do? What is my own performance? And so this kind of self-control of the street-level bureaucrats or the civil servants or the employees of bureaucracy. What is output? Output controls, you see that. Decentralization, a certain type of autonomization of the administrative units or of the associations. And all of that was centered, and it's not written here, but I think those are important ideas. Those things, this managerial revolution of transformation, if you want, of new public management in the context of the public sector, of the associative sector, third sector, had of course the aim of reducing costs, cutting costs, reducing costs, but as well optimize or increase the democratic transparency of the functioning of the administration. So the idea, in the end of the day, that traditional bureaucracy are not responsible. They are very responsive. They are not responsible at some point as well, but they are not responsive. They don't respond to um, the claims or to the requests by the public, and they are too heavy and they are not efficient enough, but as well from an accountability perspective. So we know that they cost a lot of money, but in the end, they are not open to the requests of the public. Okay, so this was a little bit, I would say, from our perspective, the ideology, if you want. But if we want to make um, the public bureaucracy more efficient, we have to make it more open, more responsive, more accountable, and the way to achieve that is to use private management tools in the public sector, in the context of the public sector. Okay, so this is in this context that, in the end of the day, the people who were still interested um, by social policy making and by the idea that we need solidarity, we need to make up for inequalities in the context of specific policy domains. These people, in order to try to resist to this flow and to this domination of this neoliberal agenda, that they had to come up with a keyword or with a way to resist this, and this keyword was social innovation. So we should, by then, they felt people who were sensitive to social policy issues and to solidarity matters, but the only way they could present a kind of legitimate way of formulating social policy instruments was to use the, this notion of social innovation. So the idea that social policy making can match, in the end of the day, can fit into this program of new public management, of neoliberal reorganization of the state and of the social policy sector. So this is clearly one specific context, and I think that clearly again the country of origin of this kind of mindset, of this kind of framing of the notion of social innovation is the English context or the British context of the, I would say, late 1980s, and it has developed a big deal over the 1990s in this country, and from this very influential country in the context of the European Union, it has spread and it has circulated all over Europe, beginning with the North European countries, Scandinavia, and then Germany, and then it came throughout the entire continent. New public management and the idea that social innovation makes sense in this context. Second origin, a completely different context. Social innovation has as well developed from the domain of social economy. So social economy, in French we call that économie sociale et solidaire. I don't know the concept in Italian, but I think that it exists because I know that this intersection between market economy and third sector, so we have on the same time the values of democracy, independence from the public institutions, solidarity, the idea of meeting local, meeting human needs. So the idea that we create a wealth that is not a market type of wealth. We don't want to constitute a capital here. We want to create a wealth that is inclusive, that is shared. But we believe in the market, and we think that the public hand is not the answer for everything. So I know that this kind of intersection is very strong in Italy, with the cooperative movement, associations, social enterprises. But it's specifically the cooperatives I know, that are very strong in Italy. So I think there must be a kind of generic concept for that, which is not a social economy. Maybe this is something that we can discuss together. But anyway, in this networks, in this milieu of corps, associations, so social economy, let's say, the development and the investment in this notion of social innovation has been very strong as well. So the idea that we can focus on individual needs and that we can focus on the individual needs, and that social innovation should meet individual needs, social needs that matter, and that are dynamics. There might be a transformation here of the expectations of the individuals, because there's always a social dynamic. So the needs of the individuals are transformed all the time, and we need innovation. So we need social schemes, we need social instruments of social policies that would meet those new needs as they get transformed by social dynamics, historical dynamics. So you see how different those both contexts are, and the values that are associated and that matter in both those contexts. A clearly liberal, centered on private company, centered on the idea that the private is effective and that the public is non-effective. So it's really, if we think in terms of market, public, here we are clearly in the context of the market. Market is important, it's performance. So this is this British idea, let's say, new public management, very strong. And on the other hand, we don't have the public in the idea of the let's say social economy. We have rather something here in between the private and the economy and the public. But we have something which is centered maybe on rather new values, so anti-authoritarian, individualistic, environmentalist values. So maybe this type of values. But anyway, something which is much more oriented towards the values of solidarity, of inclusiveness, and not at all competition, market, anti-public. And so this is completely different. So this might be, in my view, a very strong hypothesis or explanation why the content of social innovation is always or very often rather fuzzy, and we are not really sure what we are talking about, because we have those both very and clearly differentiated from another, those two clearly origins, very differentiated origins. So we have here a variety of contexts and influences, liberal on one way, efficiency, cost reduction, centered on private, and the second is rather democracy, solidarity. So there's divergence, but there are common dimensions here, and those are the defining, in my view, factors here. There's something missing, but I will add right away, because I think we have to have it clearly in mind. Sorry about that. Output and process. Yes. So what matters here, the points that matter in spite of these tensions between those both poles, let's say, we have common dimensions. First of all, we have the idea of newness. There are new human needs, and we need to address those new human needs. So the idea that an innovation meets and is something pragmatic, it's not something theoretical, it's something pragmatic, it's something that should address emerging needs in the population. Second point, it's centered on concrete needs, so it's an application, I already said, but this is the idea. So new needs, and then pragmatic. And then the third point that I had forgotten to write down, but that matters a lot, is this tension between output and process. I will get back to that in the detail when I will be giving precise definitions of what it means, it is meant by that. But it's the idea that a social innovation, it's a new service, for instance, but it's not only a new service. It as well concerns itself with the process developed by the actors who are able to precisely come up with a new service or with a new way of meeting emerging social needs, human social needs. Okay, so we have always this idea that we are not only interested when we look at social innovations, we are not only interested in what is new, what is the new policy making instrument, what is the new social service, but we are interested as well in the way the actors have learned together how to develop and how to meet new emerging human social needs. Okay, so those are the important points. And then last point of context that, in my view, justifies that we are interested by this notion is the idea that this notion of social innovation has been taken over by the European Union at the beginning of the 2000s, of the year 2000, and has focused a lot of energy on this issue. And if you look into the internet and you put the keywords in Google, social innovation and European Union, you will find tons of reports, of conferences, of policy papers, of expertise, etc., etc. I will say more on that and why I put here consensual world. Yeah, we see we have a polarity here. We have clearly a liberal dimension, and we have clearly a more solidaristic dimension to that. And you know, Brussels is confronted with the diversity of the national cultures, of the national ways of making and of thinking of policy making, of thinking of solidarity, of thinking of what is social justice, what is fairness, what is a good employment policy, what is a good addiction or anti-addiction policy, etc. What is prevention? So at some point, the European Union is always looking for consensual words, consensual notions, consensual encompassing, if you want. So notions that can contain a huge diversity of concrete ways of doing social policy, for instance, or of being political. And this is a criticism that very often is addressed to the European Union, that it confines this encompassing quality of the policy making and the policy agenda of the European Union, is that it confines to being empty. So this is all an important point when we're talking about social innovation. It's fuzzy, it's vague. Now we have discovered why it's fuzzy, it's vague. It's not that it's fuzzy, it's vague and vague in my view. It's rather that it's polarized, and we have two diverging and strong contexts of meaning for this concept. And so when the European Union has entered into this debate, it has tried to kind of try to make a kind of consensus with that, and try to find a kind of middle way between the one and the other view of social innovation. So we will be looking into those things if you want, so that we can comprehend a little bit better what social innovation is, in the end of the day, really about. So this is the outline of today's course. Sorry for this a little long introduction, but I think that this is those are important points in terms of context. So we will look more precisely into definition so that we get a better picture of where of these contexts and of these not ideological but project dimension, of political dimension, if you want, of social innovation. And then I would like to forget this abstract notion, or not completely, but to look at the results that I have coordinated a few years ago about social innovation at local level. It was a comparative analysis in 3 countries: Scotland, region or countries, Scotland, Switzerland, and Germany. And I will try to give you an impression of this research project, and maybe to shed new light, I hope, on why is social innovation an interesting concept in the context of policy analysis, of course. But you will see it will be, again, long-term care for the aged, etc., etc., but it will get very concrete, because we will be handling concrete cases of social innovations in various cities of those countries. Okay, so let us move on about let us move on, and let us begin with by having a look at specific definitions in both the universes that I have, or the poles that I have indicated, that I have mentioned just earlier on. First of all, we have to look to the UK, as I said, to the United Kingdom, and to the policy discourse, and to the framing that has taken place of this notion of social innovation in this country. And we have a very much cited, quoted paper by a colleague called Stephen Osborne. It's a paper from the late 1990s, so it could already look back to all the debates that have developed, as I said, from the mid-1980s, I would say, and throughout the 1990s. So he would give a definition which, and he would acknowledge that himself, which is very much influenced by the organizational, so management, like, if you want, also, or there's as well organizational sociology. So it's not management, but it's really the thinking of how the organization works, and how the interplay between the organization and social actors, how that works, and how this is important for us to understand, and related as well to market study, as you will see. So clearly, this orientation rather oriented towards management, let's say, and new public management. So I would say the introduction of new knowledge into a service system and its application through not its discovery, sorry. So it's not an invention, but it's an innovation. So we would apply new knowledge. This introduction produces a process of organizational transformation. So it's a learning process. We reorganize the organization, the institution, the agency, the administration, which itself produces discontinuity in the service production system, either in terms of the service itself and or its environment, its end user group, and or its host organization. So you see, they insist very much on this tension that I just mentioned here earlier on, between output and process. So if we want to make sense of innovation, of social innovation, we have to be very clear about the idea that it's not just providing a new way of dealing with disability, for instance, but it means that in order to develop a new way to dealing with disability, let's say organize a vacation for people with disability, if we want really to provide a new way for these people to go on holiday, or to provide a new service to um, this target group, let's say, I don't like this vocabulary, but let's say, let's have it. So if we want to do this really, we have as well to change the procedures internally at the level of the association, or in the context of our social work department, or to cooperate with other providers, hotel, public finances, parents associations. I don't know, but it requires a new organization. I hope it will be more concrete when we give examples of why this is so, and what is meant by that. Just here an idea, if we consider how we can develop a typology and classify the various forms of innovation, this might be interesting. We have two dimensions here. We have the dimension of the x-axis, so the horizontal axis is the axis of the innovation on the production system. So the universe of reference here is what already exists. What are the provision, the social services that exists in our field of intervention. So we have either something or some innovation that are rather moderately or only not completely revolutionary. They are rather incremental. This is the word I was looking for. So rather incremental innovation. So we do not totally overwhelm and totally transform the market. It's rather there, the direction of low innovation, and here we would have revolutionary, something much more challenging for the system. And the second dimension, the epsilon axis, is oh, I think I got confused here. I'm sorry. The epsilon axis is what I said about the nature of the product. So it's centered on the product. I'm sorry. I explained it really badly. So the exactly. So the vertical dimension here. So the epsilon axis here is related to the market as it is structured. Okay, so it's really, do we have something, an incremental change and transformation of the supply, or is it something much more revolutionary? So it's this dimension here, and we have here revolutionary. Or x-axis, what is the innovation that is required by the production system? How far do I have to challenge the way I, as the head or as the coordinator of production, do I have to reorganize my service, my administration, my staff, my working procedures, so that I am capable of producing these new and this social innovation. Okay, so social innovation is always a kind of a challenge for the way an administration, a work department, an association works, and this is an important idea to have in mind. Okay, so this is this view, this first view, you see clearly relating, meeting new needs on the one hand, but as well challenging the way the administration, the association, again, or the company providing social services is working. So this is an important point here. If, on the contrary, we are looking at social innovation as it is defined in the context of solidar economy and of the traditional, I would say, third sector mindset and third sector networks, then we would have a definition of social innovation that is much more centered on the idea that we have to address unmet needs. And those unmet needs, this unmet social needs, specific populations, they are due to the failure or the absence of market or state provision. So this is the idea clearly, and you see how far this is a definition by above all Simone Baglioni, who is an Italian colleague working in Edinburgh and Glasgow, but anyway in Scotland. And this is someone who is clearly very much interested in the third sector and third sector issues. If you look for his work and for his articles, you will see he's really a very good specialist of third sector activities and the way third sector develop social services. So this is clearly his interest, and he points here to the incapacity, to the failure of the market, of both the market and the state. So this is really a way to pointing to the capacity and to the ability and to the agility of the third sector, and to be closer and to be more pragmatic and to be closer to the needs of the population, and being at best able to develop matching and relevant services. So here we have as well something and a kind of discourse, and we have this tension between outcome, so the product, so the new service, and as well the way those services are produced. But here this is rather limited. This is rather focused on the way and on the fact that only associations and only the third sector and third sector actors are able to produce those pragmatic and those relevant social innovation. Then if we go and if we move on towards the direction that I pointed to earlier on, this is really the time from which the European Union, so from the early 2000s, has began to be interested in by this agenda in terms of European Union. From the early 2000s, I think I mentioned that already in the previous course, European Union has begun to invest a little bit in social policy matters. So from the meeting and summit of Amsterdam in 1970, and then specifically from Lisbon, the Treaty of Lisbon in 2000, the European Union has engaged really in social policy matters. And it has done like that in a way that was aiming at reconciling the objective of market performance. So this is, let's say, this UK expectation of emphasizing liberal, the performance of a liberal market economy, and so to take this policy or political priority seriously. So the idea that the European Union shouldn't spend more money on social policy, or that the member states shouldn't spend more money on social policy issues, but rather shrink the expenses in this kind of expenses or of policy making issues, and all that, for instance, the appropriate way to reach this this control or this yeah, this cut in expenses was to implement new public management methods. Okay, so we have this orientation, but we have as well the orientation of social inclusion that was much more advocated for by the Southern European countries, but as well by the Scandinavian countries that were as well sensitive to social policy issues. Sweden, you can imagine. But by then there were, I think, left governments in France at least, and maybe in Spain as well. So those were countries that were as well advocating really for the idea that a social policy agenda by the European Union shouldn't be about promoting the liberal market economy, but as well promoting instruments aiming at social inclusion issue. And so the European Union has focused very much on this issue of social innovation, of this concept, because it could, again, as it had been already developed in both those universes and both poles, that it could be a very practical keyword and a keyword that would make sense in this context. So again, if you look into the internet, you will find a lot of material and at some point interesting things, because there's in most policy papers, reports, summaries of conferences, etc. You will find really many things. There's always dimensions, or there's always reflections about what is the content, what are the values, what is the political positioning, and why is social innovation important from a, not theoretical, but let's say from an ideational. So what is the content in terms of ideas that makes social innovation interesting. So you have this part, but then you have as well a lot of content about the idea that we would present, discuss, and learn from concrete cases. So it's as well this period, the 2000s, is as well the period, and that I will add as well in the PowerPoint, because I think that this is important, of not only policy transfer, but best practices. So this is, I think, a notion that I already mentioned earlier on, but this is really this idea that this is a very concrete and pragmatic way of dealing with the European construction, dealing with Europeanization, is to reflect in terms of practices, of policy instruments, concrete policy schemes that have been developed in any European countries, doesn't matter, but as they have proved efficient, I don't know, in the Danish, in the English, in the Italian context, then why shouldn't they get disseminated? Why shouldn't they get promoted and implemented and maybe adapted in the first place, but then in the end of the day implemented in the rest of Europe? Okay, so the idea that some social innovations prove efficient and that we should share best practices. So if you look into this report, you will find as well a lot of best practices from which we still can learn, or that could constitute interesting input for us in the various contexts of work in which we are concretely working or thinking um, about social innovation or about concrete um, development of policy instruments. Okay. So, long story short, what is the kind of definition? But in the end of the day, the European Union came up with, given this context of trying to build a consensus, but we know that we have to develop a kind of synthesis between those both strong orientation, again, the liberal market one, and the more solidaristic one. A definition that I found myself for research, but as well rather representative of what the European Union would say, is an extract or is a quotation from a report um, from the year 2010, so already 10 years old. But I think this is rather characteristic of what the European Union has done during the year 2000. So it's the idea that social innovations are new ideas that simultaneously meet social needs and create new social relationships. So we have here um, three basic ideas in the end of the day that are very characteristic of this thinking in terms of social innovation. First, we have the idea that we have to deal with new ideas. So it's something, the newness is important, but this newness is not any newness, but it's new idea that are important because they make sense in the context of concrete social needs. So they meet these new ideas, they meet new social needs. But very importantly, they as well are important, and there it's not only the output, but it's the context of the process. Is that the important process in the context of his definition is that those new products, these new ways of handling social needs, create new social relationships. Create new social relationships. So this is the idea which is important. We have to deal in this in the context of his definition. We have to deal with social policy instruments that most of the time imply the cooperation between a social work department, one associations, but with other actors, with families, with the concerned persons, with public administrations, etc. So the idea here is that any form of social innovation or any form of um, social service, new social service in the end of the day, requires the cooperation of various social actors, and that any new forms of social relationships between those actors is something positive, because we live in a world, social policy, the domain of social policy, in which there must be cooperation between the various actors so that we can avoid competition, and we can avoid as well the fact that every actor would provide its own services without taking care, without considering the action of other actors. So we need coordination, we need new social relationships at the level of the actors, providers, organized actors, but as well at the level of the social workers, at the level of the individuals, at the level of the people who concretely provide the services. Okay, so we have really this idea that locally, for instance, there are learning processes that matter a lot in the context of social innovation. We have, if you look a little bit in the internet, you will find a lot as well of other definitions promoted by the European Union that would value a lot the learning dimension. So, but this is more or less the same. New social relationships. This is really putting the emphasis on the learning dimension for local regional actors who are able to develop new, new social services and meet social needs. Okay, so this is basically what I wanted to say about this um, the way the European Union has worked. So, in the end of the day, the new public management of this formulation, of this reframing by the European Union is rather weak, though it's important because it's not that it's not completely disappeared, because if we look at it carefully, you would see that this requires the idea that we have a diversity of service providers. So we might have associations, but it requires, or it implies as well, that we might have market actors, and that those market actors should be connected with another, or should be integrated in the active networks of social policy making at local level, for instance. So it implies that we have to deal with a lot of autonomous actors of various nature, and they have to be related, they have to be integrated with another, and I think that this is an important dimension which is which fits at least with this new public management way of thinking of social policy making. I think this is more or less what I wanted to say as an introduction about the notion of social innovation and the way it has been institutionalized, and the way it has been, first of all, framed by policy traditions, let's say, by both poles that I wanted to introduce you to, and then secondly, how it has been taken over by the European Union and made one very important keywords of the European way of making social policies. Okay, so in the second part of the session, and I will begin with a new file, I would like us to look at the results from these comparative studies at local level that I mentioned earlier on, and comparative analysis between Germany, Switzerland, and Scotland.